It's a stormy night at sea, and the passengers on this adventure cruise are settling in for dinner. But someone is taking advantage of the chaotic weather on the water. For Jacob Enns, the rough seas have turned this into anything but a pleasure cruise. Amidst the fog, Jacob is unaware that his doom lurks nearby. Because this rough night is Jacob's last. Tonight's the night that Jacob Enns is gonna go missing forever. No one knows what's happened to Jacob, who's killed him, or why. We do know that some key evidence seems to have washed away. "45-year-old Jacob Enns has just left Fort Lauderdale on a 7-day cruise. Currently docked in Nassau, this dream vacation will take him around the Caribbean. Having built and run his own armored truck service based out of Chicago, Illinois, Jacob jumps at the opportunity to sell the entire business to a multinational corporation.
I met Jacob in Chicago. He hired me for his armored truck company. We got along really well and quickly became friends. Then Jacob sold the company, and then because he wanted to travel, but we still kept in touch.
Now, with his company sold, Jacob finally realizes another lifelong dream: to travel. Jacob has arranged to meet up with his brother, Peter Enns, a restaurateur, in Fort Lauderdale after the cruise is finished.
Jacob was a hardworking guy. He couldn't stop talking about this cruise, and he deserved it. He earned it. He told me he was going to meet his brother Peter after the cruise.
Jacob is enjoying his newfound financial freedom, going out with friends and doing what he loves. One of those things is gambling. With some of the world's most luxurious casinos, Nassau was going to be the first of many trips abroad.
Even though a lot of tourists are drawn to the Bahamas for its gambling scene, it's something the locals never get to take pleasure in. They're actually not allowed to gamble.
Living the life of a bachelor, Jacob does not have any romantic interests. Instead, he focuses on his career. Jacob has never been on a cruise before. Being a consummate gambler, this is the perfect vacation to have some fun with his hard-earned money, as well as getting the chance to see some of the most beautiful parts of the world. Rather than going alone on this trip, he arranges to meet up with two of his old college roommates, Hector and Mason in Nassau, to celebrate his success on the journey home. Already a few days into the voyage, this 7-day cruise is about to leave Nassau and make several glamorous stops around the Caribbean before returning to Fort Lauderdale. Sharing a cabin, the three men settle in on their 5-day return from Nassau.
this particular trip is meant to be a reunion with some old college roommates.
The three men are enjoying the sights and sounds of the luxury cruise. Always a stickler for a fine meal, Jacob is excited for the first-class dining experiences offered on the ship. It seems as though Hector and Mason are already having too much fun. Of course, the ship's casino is a regular haunt of the traveling companions.
Jacob was really good at gambling. He would study up and he could actually pick up a game and master it.
Jacob loves all that the casino has to offer. He tries his hand at whichever game seems to catch his fancy in the moment. The problem for the other guests on this cruise is that Jacob is really good at it. Pretending to be enjoying the atmosphere from the sidelines, Hector and Mason aren't as well off, nor have the skill to enjoy gambling as much as Jacob. It's clear that Jacob and his former college mates have changed. Jacob loves a good bet and some entertainment, but he's not the same guy he was in college, while Hector and Mason are still rampant partiers.
Just because you may be good friends with someone on land doesn't mean that you're going to get along with them on a cruise or any other trip. It's very important to pick the right travel companion. So you want to make sure that your budgets align, that you like the same types of activities, that you want to do the same things, want to get the same thing out of a trip before you set sail.
Unfortunately for Jacob, he didn't have the "what kind of a trip do you like" talk with Hector and Mason, leading to some disagreements about what's going on. Having paid for the trip, Jacob expects things to go his way. But his travel companions are different kinds of people than him. When the seas are calm, Jacob is able to enjoy his trip, despite the differences he's having with his travel companions. But as the ocean becomes rough, he becomes extremely seasick. His anti-nauseants are not working.
So seasickness is real. It's not just something that means you're weak or you can't take it. It's actually a very real phenomenon where the balance in your inner ear is affected. So even really seasoned sailors can go through this if the cruise is rough enough or the sail is rough enough. It doesn't just affect newbies or rookies about ocean voyages. It can affect anyone.
I heard he got sick on the cruise, which is weird. So it must have been pretty bad for him to miss some gambling time.
Over the next couple of days on the cruise, Jacob becomes reserved and keeps to himself. Not so much that he isn't still killing it at the casino, but his demeanor is noticeably changed. Jacob visits the ship's doctor. After all his success on the tables, he's become a victim of the motion of the boat. After a brief examination, the doctor gives Jacob some anti-nauseant medication. Having done all he can for Jacob, the doctor sees him out, advising that he stay on the deck to get some fresh air and focus on the horizon. How could the doctor know that he's about to be the last person to see Jacob Enns alive? Because this is the night that Jacob Enns goes missing forever. 45-year-old entrepreneur Jacob Enns has just sold his armored transport company. To celebrate, he decides to go on a Caribbean cruise with his old college roommates, Hector Kearney and Mason Gill. Things start out great. As the trip continues, it becomes clear that Jacob has grown out of the party lifestyle that Hector and Mason still enjoy. While Jacob becomes distant, they all still enjoy time in the ship's casino. Jacob is a consummate gambler. His winning streaks are notorious, and his good luck isn't ending on the trip either. At the beginning of the trip, Jacob had made a large deposit to Mr. Brzezinski at the ship's purser's office.
The ship's purser is the accountant of the ship. They're basically there to keep track of any passenger's money. If passengers have more money than they want to keep in their cabin, they can drop it off to the purser, get a receipt. They also are in charge of making sure that the boat has all of the necessary supplies it needs for the journey.
They're also responsible for important documents like passenger manifests.
After 35 years of employment for the same cruise line and working his way up to the position of purser, this is Mr. Brzezinski's last cruise before retiring. Already having had a successful run at the Nassau casinos, Jacob makes a deposit, telling Mr. Brzezinski, the ship's accountant or purser, to see that my brother gets this if anything happens to me, which is an unusual request.
Jacob was a hard worker. He'd bury himself in his job, which is probably why he didn't really have a lot of close friends. I know his brother wanted to go on a trip, but he couldn't, which is probably why he went with his old college friends. I don't know how much he trusted them, though.
Mr. Brzezinski is surprised as Jacob refuses a receipt of the transaction, but he insists, and Jacob eventually takes it. As the seas turn rough, Jacob gets a serious case of seasickness. Hector Kearney and Mason Gill are enjoying the trip that Jacob has brought them on. On the fourth night of the trip, however, Jacob is late for dinner. Thinking nothing of Jacob being absent from dinner, the two continue to spend the evening doing all they can to have fun. Mason decides to stay a little later and let loose, while Hector goes to bed. It's not until the next morning that Hector realizes Jacob is missing. Since he's not in the room, Hector and Mason look for Jacob in his usual haunts around the ship. Seeing that Jacob isn't around any of the places they think he should be, later that afternoon, they have no choice but to report his disappearance to the ship's security.
Would the passenger in room 832 please report to security? The passenger in room 832, please report to security.
So when somebody believes a passenger is missing on a cruise ship, one of the first things that they would do is make onboard announcements over the PA system. They would call for the passenger by their room number, for example. But if they really believed you were missing, they would make the announcements, and if that didn't provide any information, they would conduct a room-to-room search, and that would help determine whether or not the person is in fact missing. Time is of the essence, obviously. If they are missing, you need to start the search as quickly as possible.
With Jacob nowhere to be seen, a complete search of the ship is conducted. Even with the cabin-to-cabin search, Jacob isn't anywhere. The ship's security chief is in charge of the investigation. The cruise continues its journey, and a search and rescue operation is undertaken. The search of the ship does yield some clues. The ship's doctor helped Jacob the night before out to the deck, saying that Jacob was very ill on account of the rough seas. Is it possible the last person to see Jacob alive is also the person who murdered him? Next, Mr. Brzezinski, the ship's purser, confirms that he remembers Jacob and relays the message that he should see that my brother gets this if anything happens to me. Mr. Brzezinski says it's odd that Jacob Enns didn't want a receipt of the transaction, as though he knew he would not be picking it up. Unfortunately, no body is recovered. Given the evidence that the ship's security was able to find, it appears that Jacob Enns has committed suicide. His sullen behavior on the last day, coupled with his instructions to give the money he left to the purser to his brother, causes the chief to offer the most convenient explanation for his disappearance. With the tragic news, Hector and Mason are in shock, but something doesn't add up. What happened to all of Jacob's winnings? He visited the purser's office as soon as he got aboard, and had won a considerable amount of money since then. Is Jacob the victim of a robbery gone wrong? Or is it feasible he took his own life for some unknown reason? Jacob Enns and his old college roommates are relaxing on a cruise, making its way through the Caribbean and back to Fort Lauderdale. Jacob is having a very successful trip at the ship's casino. However, it's become clear that Hector and Mason are a different kind of traveler than Jacob. Despite his winning streak, Jacob has become extremely ill as the seas become rough. Now, Jacob has gone missing. An investigation shows signs that Jacob has committed suicide, leaving instructions with the ship's purser to contact his brother Peter if something should happen to him.
I can't believe it. They're saying he killed himself. It's a suicide. There's no way.
Modern cruise ships employ safety standards such as uniform heights of railings and physical barriers to prevent people from inadvertently falling overboard. So a reasonable person acting normally wouldn't just find themselves able to fall off the deck of a ship. One would have to assume that if somebody did go overboard, it was either intentional on their part or foul play was likely involved.
Shaken by the turn of events, Hector and Mason try to make the best of the rest of the trip as they finish off the remaining 3 days of the cruise. Jacob's brother, Peter Enns, is notified of Jacob's untimely death and meets the ship in Nassau a couple days later. He spends the last day on the cruise as it makes its way back to Fort Lauderdale. Peter has come to retrieve his brother's items. Upon inspecting his brother's luggage, he discovers that there is blood covering the handle, and the inside of the bag has been rummaged through. How could this be a suicide if there's clear signs of interference with Jacob's things? Peter knows that Jacob was an immaculate person. He would never leave his personal effects in such disarray. The only explanation the Chief of Security and Mr. Brzezinski can provide is that Jacob had a nosebleed, or possibly a cut finger. but they refused to change their analysis of the cause of Jacob's death. Adding to Peter's suspicion, he is not allowed to take his brother's personal effects.
I can't believe it. They're saying he killed himself. It's suicide. I don't believe it. I heard they found blood on his stuff. Something's not adding up. Jacob was the cleanest guy I knew. There was just no way he would have left his stuff like that. With blood on it?
Cruise ships are essentially floating cities. They're large population for the size, and people are constantly interacting with each other. So it wouldn't be difficult to find yourself the victim of a crime on a cruise ship, whether it be a theft or an assault or some other type of crime. It happens on a cruise ship just as it would in your hometown.
Upset by the turn of events, Peter Enns decides to look into the matter himself. He talks with some of the crew members about his brother's behavior on the ship. But try as he might, his brother is just not getting the cooperation he expects from the crew. Not an uncommon complaint amongst family members of other cruise ship victims. Peter asks the crew member if she remembers Jacob. All she can say is that she remembers him winning a lot of money in the casino. Not surprised, at least Peter now has something to go on. Peter knows that his brother was supposed to meet up with his old college roommates, Hector Kearney and Mason Gill. But where are they? Peter figures they would have stuck around to see what happened with Jacob. He knows that Jacob used to be close to Hector and Mason, but he hasn't seen them in years. Could one of them be responsible for Jacob's disappearance? Hector Kearney has been a serial entrepreneur ever since he finished college. However, his ventures have routinely failed. It was no secret that Hector needed an investor to help get his next project off the ground. Hector asked Jacob if he would be interested in getting on board with the project. But the reality is, Jacob didn't feel confident investing with the kind of guy that Hector was. Was this money just what Hector needed to get his next business off the ground after all his previous ventures failed? Would Hector be willing to kill for another shot? As for Mason Gill, a salesman who did well for himself, he was expected to unwind on the trip. Mason didn't want any of his friends to know that he was massively in debt. He did well, but not well enough to support his lavish lifestyle. This all-expense-paid trip from Jacob suited him just fine. It was no secret that Mason and Jacob were having their disagreements on the trip. They had grown into different kinds of men, and the relationship was not the best. But were these disagreements enough for him to kill Jacob? Was his financial situation that dire? Mr. Brzezinski had been sailing with the cruise line for over 35 years. He'd been a purser for over 25. While passengers dropping off cash for him to put into safekeeping was common, there was seldom a time where he had taken in so much cash from one passenger. With only one more return cruise left, Mr. Brzezinski is wary of what life would bring after so long at sea. Was the money that Jacob left behind just what he needed to have a comfortable retirement? Having received the cold shoulder from the other crew members, and having seen how strangely Brzezinski was behaving when he was in his office, Peter is suspicious of what's going on the ship. Authorities bring in the ship's doctor for questioning. They detail the events of the evening and uncover the doctor has an alibi for the approximate time that Jacob disappears. Written in his patient book, a woman who was pregnant on board came to see him in fear she was in early labor.
Everybody was acting so shady. The person who murdered Jacob needs to pay for their actions. And poor Peter, his brother, he was trying to track them down. He needed to know what happened to his brother. He wasn't going to rest until he found justice for him.
Suicide is often the knee-jerk response that cruise ships give when something happens to a passenger. The reason for this is it's very easy for them. Then they don't have to investigate. If it's a suicide, they're not at fault. The person chose to take their life, so they have no liability. It's very easy for them to just get out of an investigation that way. However, in this case, there were several things that cast suspicion on the idea that this man would have killed himself. One, he left a significant amount of money and belongings with the purser, saying that if anything happened to him, to give it to his brother, which suggests that maybe he had an idea that something was going to happen to him. And another odd thing about this case is the duffel bag. It had blood on the handle, blood inside on the contents, and the victim's brother knew his own brother would never leave his items in such disarray. They were all messed up inside. It looked like someone had pawed through them with blood all over his hands. So that's another thing that casts suspicion on this case.
Given the circumstances, Peter can't help but feel a nagging suspicion that one of the three, Hector Kearney, Mason Gill, or Mr. Brzezinski, could be responsible for his brother's death. But how can he prove it? Jacob Enns has disappeared off his vacation cruise on his way back to Fort Lauderdale. Joining him on his trip are his old college roommates, Hector Kearney and Mason Gill. Unfortunately for Jacob, the rough seas are not agreeing with him, forcing him to stay on deck until he feels better. Little does he know that this is the last visit to the deck he'll ever make. With the initial thought that he has committed suicide or fallen off the boat in the rough seas, new evidence has emerged that puts this theory into question. Jacob's brother Peter has arrived on the scene to identify his brother's belongings. But after discovering blood on the inside of Jacob's bag, he is unable to leave the ship with it.
The person who murdered Jacob needs to pay for their actions. And poor Peter, his brother, he was trying to track them down. He needed to know what happened to his brother. He wasn't going to rest until he found justice for him.
Peter tries the local police station to report what's going on. But since the incident happened in international waters, the police are unable to help him as they have no jurisdiction. They point him toward the FBI.
When you're a passenger on a cruise ship, you're subject to different laws compared to when you're back at home. The cruise ship is out on international waters, or it might be in a different port. You're subject to the laws of the flag of the country the cruise ship is flying. When it's in port, you're subject to the laws of the land where the cruise ship is docked. The laws that you're in fact used to living under might be different from the laws that you're subject to when you're on the cruise ship.
They're subject to maritime law. Your ticket is actually a contract that says this. A lot of people have no idea when they board a cruise that they're no longer under the rules of America or Canada or wherever they may be from.
Peter is haunted by the loss of his brother and is determined to get to the bottom of his disappearance. Was it the purser, Mr. Brzezinski, and his assistant, Arthur? Was the amount of money that Jacob left with them just too much to resist? Did Mr. Brzezinski arrange for crew members to throw Jacob Enns overboard? Since Mr. Brzezinski was set to retire in a few short weeks, it makes sense that he could possibly be after a big payout. By offering a bribe to crew members, Mr. Brzezinski is the only one who has access to Jacob's considerable deposit in the safe. A crew member's hand was cut in the scuffle, causing him to leave a trail of evidence on Jacob's bag. Is it conceivable that whoever cut themselves is who robbed Jacob? But how would the purser have known where to look in Jacob's room for more money?
Another strange thing about this case is he was known to have won a lot of money, but no one could find it. It was missing, even though it was supposed to be in his bag. When they looked at the bag, it was covered in blood. Even the belongings were covered in blood. It seems like robbery could be a very strong motive for murder.
Arriving at the FBI office to report his brother's disappearance, Peter is surprised to find that they are expecting him. After reviewing the items from Mr. Brzezinski, the FBI returns Jacob's valuables to Peter.
Jacob had entrusted a purser with some of his property for safekeeping, a quantity of money, as well as 2 gold watches that had belonged to him. So in an initial cabin search, these items weren't there when they may have expected to be. So it may have in fact looked like a robbery at the time. At the end of the day, the purser returned the items.
The act of Brzezinski returning Jacob's belongings may clear his name, but the question remains: what happened to Jacob's winnings that weren't in the safe? Who would know where he kept this money? It appears as though the thief and murderer is still at large.
I couldn't believe it, but all the signs were pointing to his college buddies. How can they even think of doing that to him? He paid for their trip.
This only leaves Mason and Hector as the possible suspects. Would Hector and Mason really have been the culprits? They would know that he won the money, and they would know where his bags were. After the disagreements on board and the disparity of wealth between the travelers, it's possible that it was only a matter of time before Jacob's co-travelers wanted revenge. With both Mason and Hector in dire financial straits, Jacob seems like an angel when he reaches out to ask them on the trip. Unable to coax any money from him for their personal lives, all of Jacob's winnings are too much for his companions. Maybe they plan to kill him, or maybe they plan to just send a message. Either way, this just turned into a one-way trip for Jacob. But unfortunately, they have all but disappeared. After initially thinking that Jacob Enns' disappearance from his cruise ship was suicide, evidence surfaces that shows Jacob met with a more sinister end. Thinking it might have been the ship's purser, Mr. Brzezinski, who had him killed, Jacob's brother Peter is pleasantly surprised to learn that Mr. Brzezinski has turned over all of Jacob's things to the FBI, including over $10,000 in cash. Unfortunately, this leaves only Jacob's former college roommates and cruise ship companions, Hector and Mason, as suspects. With Hector and Mason missing themselves as soon as the ship docks, Peter remembers Mason's parents live in Fort Lauderdale. His only hope is that Mason has been in contact with them. Luckily for Peter, Mason is at his parents' house visiting. While he doesn't know where Hector is, he speaks at length about Jacob's disappearance. Mason tells Peter his version of the night. He's with Hector most of the night at the club. However, Hector leaves early to go to bed. Mason goes on to tell Peter that for the following days on the cruise, Hector seems almost nervous. Although Mason's story seems true, Peter is still unsure. Mason can see this and tells Peter he can have people back up his alibi that he spent the night with.
By all accounts, Mason was as normal as he could have been.
Mason breaks down and admits to Peter that things were a bit rocky. Given their differences in economic standing, Mason's drinking, and their party lifestyles, it was obvious early on that they had grown apart.
But that he was doing his best to try and smooth things over with Jacob. With Mason having an alibi and seeming to be on the up and up, that only leaves Hector Kearney as a suspect.
Was Jacob rejecting Hector's investment proposal what pushed him to commit murder?
I'm still shocked that one of his so-called friends could do this. Peter kept looking for Hector and wasn't going to rest until he found him. How could Hector Kearney be the one who's guilty when he's sharing a room with both Mason and Jacob?
With Mason staying out longer to let loose,
Hector has time to meet Jacob on the deck of the ship. Hector surprises Jacob in an effort to do away with him. Jacob is easily taken off guard when attacked by his supposed friend. During the struggle, Hector cuts his hand. The stormy night, large waves would have washed the deck clean. Since they're sharing a room, Hector had free and open access at all times. Hector knows exactly where Jacob was storing his winnings from the casino. After the crime is done, Hector cleans up his mess just before Mason returns to the room.
Mason, slightly intoxicated, notices Jacob's not there.
And Mason figures he's either still sick or at the casino.
Statistically, the victim of a crime is more likely to suffer at the hands of somebody they're acquainted with or know in some capacity, as opposed to being the victim of some random act where there's no connection whatsoever with the perpetrator.
Hector's friendship is clearly not worth as much as Jacob's winnings or life. Desperate and living a life of abject failure, Hector seemingly does the worst imaginable thing to his old friend. Is jealousy or greed his driving force? Only Hector knows the truth behind his actions. As for Peter, his efforts to uncover the truth about his brother ultimately reveals the details of his murder. But with Hector still on the loose, authorities must track him down, or it'll all be for nothing. With a manhunt underway, it won't take long to track down Hector Kearney. Once they scour the area where the cruise ship landed, they make their way to his hometown. On August 15, 2013, Hector Kearney is arrested in his hometown of Cedar Point, Ohio. He signs a complete confession soon after.
You know, as an investigator in a case like this, the easiest course would be to believe that this person just committed suicide in the absence of any other information.
Even though suicide may be the easiest answer to these cases, it's not always the right one. In fact, except for 10%, so that's 90% of these cases are not suicide. In this case, his friend Hector was the one who confessed to killing him and leaving his own blood on the bag. Sometimes the easiest answer is not the correct one.
There appeared to be a little more complexity to this than first believed. And at the end of the day, the investigation needed to continue.
Unfortunately, on the open seas with a large group of people, anything is possible, including murder. Lucky for Jacob, his brother Peter never gave up on finding the right answers.
It's crazy that Peter had to do all this work to get the answers. These are people's lives. We owe it to them to discover the truth so they can rest easy. I still can't believe what happened to Jacob, but I'm glad Hector is behind bars paying for what he's done. I hope people hear Jacob's story, because I wouldn't want this to happen to anyone else.
Hector is sentenced to life in prison for murdering Jacob Enns. He's also charged with theft over $10,000 for the money he stole. Although Hector spent some of the money, the remaining amount is returned to Jacob's family. Now behind bars, Hector will pay for his actions for the rest of his life. If Peter Enns had not continued his search for justice and followed his lead, his brother's killer would still be roaming free. Despite the tragic event to befall their family, Peter can hold his head high that he was instrumental in bringing Hector Kearney to justice.